And of course, we'll go to our guest, Mark Merowitz. He's a professor at State University, New York Maritime College. Now, thank you so much for joining us, Mark Merowitz. So now, let me also begin by asking you the same question. What is your first impression of Biden's farewell speech from the Oval Office?
Well, I think it was pretty much off the wall. I thought it was very, very strange in some respects. So first of all, he brought up a lot of points that I think about the oligarchy and the robber barons in American history that I thought was completely bizarre. And then he talked about Eisenhower talked about the military industrial complex to talk about a tech industrial complex. I think there is a criticism of Elon Musk implicitly in the new administration. Then he went about AI and the dangers of AI, and I certainly think that's a valid point, but to throw it in. Hello?
You're right.
Am I on? Am I supposed to speak?
Yes. Yes, sir. You can
Someone
absolutely
interrupted me. Mm-hmm. Okay. So the other thing was that he talked about the 18-year time limit for Supreme Court judges, which was a failure of the Biden administration, and there's no way you can do that. He talked about congressmen should not be able to trade stock. The Constitution should have no immunity for a president while in office. So what is this all about? To sum it up, it is an implicit, attack on Trump, Musk, and the Republicans, okay? And then he also took credit for the hostage deal without giving any credit to President Trump or his envoy, in that he says that he did the deal, it was his deal, and that Trump is going to implement the deal, when in fact it was Trump's envoy, Mr. Witkoff, who helped to make it happen. It's because Trump said all hell is going to break loose unless there's no hostage release. So I think all around, it was very disappointing to me to have Biden speak in this way. It's really what he's trying to do is he's trying to throw darts at the Trump presidency. Also, at the same time, says he's for an orderly, peaceful transition, which is great. But this speech, the tone of it, not just overtly, but covertly, is a criticism of Trump and Trump's people, and no immunity while the president is committing crimes in office. What in the world does he think he's talking about? He's talking about Trump. Incidentally, earlier today in the press conference, when Biden announced the hostage deal, he actually said that the attack on October 7th was by Hezbollah, not Hamas. So really, this is just very, very shocking all around to have this be the final words, and that he thinks Hezbollah attacked on October 7th. I think the president should have made this a more presidential speech, not these barbs against Musk and the tech complex. I mean, to compare it to Eisenhower's military-industrial complex, I have to say, is an utter shocker. It is ridiculous. And I'm sorry to be so candid, but you asked me what I thought, and I was very disappointed. A president who goes out of office should be more general and encouraging and not so critical of, even though he, and the other thing I would say just to conclude on this point is this point about Kamala Harris is like, oh, so close to me, and Doug and Kamala. Are you kidding me? The points that he made during the campaign helped to upend and destroy her campaign. I mean, really. So the thing is just, I'm befuddled by this. I don't get it.
Right. All right. Of course, so do stay with us. I'll go back to Susan now. Now, Biden said it will take time to feel the full impact of his administration's accomplishments. How do you think the American people are taking his final speech?
I mean, you just heard Mark. I think he basically echoed what possibly every American watching that speech was thinking. And I think when he said it'll take time to see the full effect, there was sort of a shiver down everyone's spine of, oh God, what is going to happen worse than what has happened, at least economically, and what the American people had experienced and what they basically voted out of office. But nonetheless, like I mentioned, he, for whatever reason, thinks that he was a change maker. Those that criticize him are going to say that he lives in a different reality than most Americans and most of what we saw. But we saw this pattern with Biden through the beginning of his presidency, with the Afghanistan withdrawal, with the Inflation Reduction Act, with the illegal migrants saying that the border is safe. Time after time, he presented these alternative realities to the American people, whether behind the desk at the Oval Office during press conferences or through his administration, that just was not what the majority of the American people were seeing and feeling and experiencing. And I think that this speech really was a culmination of all of that, for one last time, for a lack of a better word, gaslighting the American people. But like I said, his supporters are going to say that this was an impactful speech. He was brave. He talked about, guardrails and social media and whatnot. But I think for the majority of Americans, they're happy to turn the page.
Absolutely. Now, you mentioned guardrails. Of course, this is how he ended his speech. He said he ended his farewell on an optimistic note, probably saying he implores Americans to stand guard. I'll come to you, Mr. Merowitz. Now, he, of course, we know it's been like 50 years of his politics, and this is his end speech. How do you see him as politically? How do you see him after you heard his last speech?
Look, Biden spent 50 years of public service to this country. There's no question about it. He was a senator, he was vice president, he was president, and we Americans respect the office of the presidency. So no question about that. He will have a legacy, no doubt about it. But at the same time, the recent campaign was very, very worrisome for the American people. You had Biden in there as the candidate. He drops out suddenly on a Sunday. Kamala Harris comes in. She was the vice president, who, again, without expanding on this, did absolutely nothing during her vice presidency. She was the border czar. She didn't go to the border. I mean, it was an outrage to put her in as the candidate. And actually, she was really doomed to failure. She only had a number of days to do this. She did a terrible, terrible job as the Democratic candidate. And Biden set her up really for failure once he was out and knew he was out and wouldn't have a chance to a second term. He actually even said thereafter he would have beaten Trump. Well, be that as it may, she came in and suddenly she was the candidate who was going to fail and also he did a number of things that really helped to undermine her candidacy. So that will affect his legacy as well. I think Democrats will think that he fought the good fight. Perhaps he did. Democrats will commend him for his feelings and his ideas. But when he comes there at the end, and he again, just to talk about this, I think it's disingenuous to come and say, Kamala was my great vice president and all of that. I got to tell you, the people in India, the people in America, these are people who are able to get common sense and pay attention to reality. And when you hear that, you sit back and you say, really? What in the world is this man talking about? What is he talking about? What did she accomplish? I mean, he brings it home in a way that is not realistic and believable. And I think his legacy is there. He's a president. He will be admired for his presidency as time goes on. No question about it, because we respect the office of the president. But as I said before, these little themes in his speech, a president shouldn't get immunity for crimes committed during his presidency. Gee, what is that all about? Well, because the Supreme Court, which is our Supreme Court and the law of the land, said there is a limited form of immunity for presidents while they are in office, meaning that applies to Trump. So does he mean that he doesn't agree with the United States Supreme Court? Does he want to amend the Constitution to provide that presidents shouldn't have immunity? I mean, as I said, I'm surprised that this is his sort of coda, the end of his administration, that he's bringing out all these things. By the way, some of these are so significant, they don't really belong in 2-second time points in a speech of this importance. Many Americans are going to be listening to this, whether Democrats or Republicans. The theme should be about America going forward, working together, to doing things together, Democrats, Republicans, all Americans united to support the president. And that was not the theme. That was not the theme. The theme was, oh, it's worrisome. All these horrible things are coming. Please be careful. There's a tech industrial complex. It's going to be scary, and there's AI. That's not a message that is going to be warming and encouraging to people going forward. I was disappointed.
All right. Now, this, of course, as you mentioned earlier, it comes before, just after he announced the ceasefire. And when it comes to that, of course, there's always talk about who takes the credit. What do you have to say on that? Mr. Mayor,
Is that for me?
Of course, I was just asking you. Now, of course, it comes to who takes the credit. This was a question, and of course, one of the journalists did ask, and we played that by where he turns out and says, "Is that a joke?" How do you take that up?
About the credit? Well, look, when he spoke at his press conference today, and also at the press conference, basically he is taking credit for it. The fact is that his own advisor, I think it was Jake Sullivan or one of his advisors, stated very clearly that they could not have done this deal without Trump. I saw this was posted on Twitter. There's no question that the Biden administration, the people in national security are working on this, attributed a lot of this to having Trump involved in it. So that's the thing. But also I would say that if you look at this deal, it is a very questionable deal. Biden wanted it wrapped up, but it's Trump who said all hell is going to pay, is going to happen if there's no deal. They made a deal, and the first phase of it is a trickle out of hostages, starting with 3 hostages, not 33 hostages, and all the hostages are not being released. So it is really a completely imbalanced deal between Israel and Hamas. And I must say that it's seen many, certainly around the world, are very disappointed in the deal. And it's really Biden's fault because he didn't stand up like Trump and say, all hell is going to break loose unless you make a deal. By the way, an interesting analogy is that in the Iran hostage deal, which I'm sure you remember from 1979, 1980, and happen to know personally 2 of the hostages, diplomats who were held hostage in Iran during that crisis. Interestingly, that the hostages were released only when Carter went out of office and Reagan came into office. Similarly, in this hostage deal, Biden is going out of office and Trump is coming into office. So, interesting, fascinating comparisons. But it also shows to me that Hamas, if you look, is very, very, very sophisticated in manipulating the West, because the West and Israel takes pride in life, and Hamas doesn't take pride in life. They just take hostages. They're like criminal kidnappers, and they're being rewarded with the fact that you're going to release 3 hostages, and then you're going to start releasing terrorist prisoners. And I don't think any sane, democratic, free society would ever do that if we had kidnappers or murderers. But apparently, in this context, it is appropriate to do this. So this deal is not something that we have to be elated about. It is something to be worried about, whether it's going to take place or not. But at the bottom line is the hostages have to come out, and they're not all coming out. So, again, I'm happy for the hostages that are coming out. I'm happy the Biden and Trump people worked on it to do this, to achieve this. But it was all about the deadline of Trump coming into office. That was the key to making even this deal a possibility.
All right. Now, of course, off to Susan. If I have to take your final reactions, this, of course, as I asked our guest, this is before the, just after the announcement of the ceasefire deal. I'm sure the Americans are obviously observing this as he has finalized the ceasefire. How are they looking forward to this? How are they reacting to the ceasefire?
I think everyone is looking with cautious optimism. There are going to be apparently Americans in that hostage release process. But I think, as Mark mentioned, most Americans are looking at this through the lens of where American foreign policy is going to be headed, notably towards the Middle East, and how influential President-elect Donald Trump was in threatening Hamas to release the hostages before he was elected. And again, the analogy is not lost among most Americans who remember it and who studied it and who had seen it, that how similar this is to, what happened with the Iran hostage crisis in 1979, where the Iranian Ayatollah Khomeini waited until Ronald Reagan was sworn in when he started releasing the hostages from Iran in a bid to embarrass Jimmy Carter. And the legacy of that for Democrats is Jimmy Carter did the legwork and ultimately Reagan got the credit. That wasn't the case, obviously, and it's not the case here either. So, history will show that it was definitely the president-elect and the way he tried to handle this that at least got something of this sort, of a hostage release, of some sort of cautious optimism out of, this crisis that we've seen for the almost past 2 years.
Interesting. Now, of course, half a century of political background, Biden's last speech at the final of the Oval Office. Of course, there are different reactions coming in, but thank you so much to both of you, our guest Mark Merovitz and our correspondent Susan Zidani, for joining us and giving us your perspective.